Yes, thank you to the organizers for this invitation. This is a very rare and welcome opportunity for me. Basically, my presentation looks at the perspective of three main actors, of course, US, China, and the Philippines. And I guess the main message is that we really have a rather complex situation before us at so many different levels. If you look at the domestic politics, the national interests, and the regional security and other concerns involved. And there's there doesn't seem to be an easy way out for the region as a whole in managing the South China Sea conflicts and the disputes. But there is a need to identify priorities for conflict management and resolution. So essentially, I have, I think, four themes that I try to develop. It's not a paper yet, no? But I'd like to talk first about self-fulfilling prophecies. The three actors, US, China, and the Philippines. If you look at the situation now compared to 5 years ago, we seem to have fallen into self-fulfilling prophecies. The second is quandaries facing each of these actors. A third is uncertainties in the way ahead, especially as the domestic politics enter into the picture. And the fourth is defining priorities. So I'll try to be brief. This is not as much a product of research as we saw in the earlier panel this morning as, I guess, general observations from constant looking at the events as they evolve in the region. And certainly a lot of conferencing and communications to and fro with other academics and other experts on this. So first on self-fulfilling prophecies. I think we understand that Chinese assertiveness and the U.S. rebalance policy in Asia are both driven by geopolitical interests. So on the one hand, on part of the United States, you have, of course, some would call it military preponderance, some primacy. So the interest in sustaining U.S. primacy on the one hand versus China's demand for strategic space. Some would call it hegemony. It all depends on the perspective, really. No? The geopolitical interests also involve the need for access to and control over supply routes, sea lanes of navigation, whether for trade, energy, military navigation. No? And as a subtext also, both US and China are interested in influence over shaping regional order, no? Or shaping the regional security architecture, if you want to be more specific. On the other hand, the Philippines, we are not a major power, of course, we are not, but we are a major player in the sense that the country has shown some capacity to impact on the regional environment through its interactions with these two big powers and through our own claims in the South China Sea. What the Philippines needs is access to resources, security against external threat, and a rules-based order that will guarantee both. No? Okay, so in my presentation, I first look at the emerging narratives, I guess, from the perspectives of US, China, and the Philippines, and to show how important perceptions are and how important they have been, resulting in self-fulfilling prophecies, as I mentioned earlier. No? Some would say security dilemmas is what we find ourselves in. No? The dominant Chinese narrative, it seems, is that the U.S. pivot or the rebalance is all about containing China's rise. No? And that China's assertive and coercive approach in the South China Sea, from the viewpoint of the other players, is really a response to these efforts by the United States to prevent China's further growth in influence and power. No? So for China, this is simply unacceptable, especially not in its backyard, but it increasingly sees in Southeast Asia as a strategic backyard. No? And therefore, it has proceeded in response to the rebalance policy with construction of islands, and as we had seen earlier, with various ostensible purposes, but including, obviously, military purposes in mind. And this has invited direct intervention of the United States. No? Well, that's a Chinese narrative in a sense. No? Compared to, say, even 5 years ago, when the United States took a neutral position, a more neutral position on the sovereignty disputes, arguably it still does, no? And was very wary about getting entrapped or entangled in the contests of a maritime nature among these countries. Now we see enhanced U.S. security arrangements and tangible new commitments to its allies and other partners in the region. So for China, one might say that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. China's actions have drawn not only the United States, but even countries like Japan, other allies, and the attention of the international community is very much on how China behaves, what China says and does with regards to this issue. No? In a way, by what I think is an overreaction to the rebalance, China has produced precisely that outcome that it prefers the least, which is a strong U.S. presence and interest in this issue. Now, for the U.S., its narrative in East Asia is that China's influence has grown. There are many narratives, of course, no? But one might say that the thinking, the perception that China's influence has grown at the expense of the influence of the United States. The rebalance, therefore, is intended to prevent the rise of a peer competitor, in other words, to defend U.S. primacy in what China increasingly claims as its a sphere of influence. No? And the self-fulfilling prophecy here is that China has really dug in. It has abandoned much of the self-restraint that it used to exercise in the past, no? Abandoning the hide and bide policy of Deng Xiaoping. It is now competing with the U.S. openly for the loyalty of smaller countries in the region, and is certainly showing a lot of muscle. No? Meanwhile, for the Philippines, hoping to benefit from the Convention on the Law of the Sea to extend its maritime rights over resources, we have challenged China diplomatically and then legally. But in the meantime, we have lost major fishing grounds due to Chinese coercion. We find our hands tied in terms of preventing encroachments on its EEZ, no? Because we have filed the legal case, we are awaiting the outcome. In the meantime, the government, rightly or wrongly, has taken a policy of not doing anything to prevent these things from happening, not encouraging our fishermen to go, stopping the oil exploration activities. And in a sense, it has put pretty much everything in this legal basket. And there is also some debate in the country over the wisdom of that. No? And at the same time, it has to call in its allies, yeah, after all. Rather, while the Philippines tries to take a moral high ground by pursuing the legal case and saying that it's not going to be a might is right situation, but right makes might, it's also in a position where it is helpless without the support of the United States, no? And that's about might rather than right. So these are some of the issues that confront the Philippines. No? But nonetheless, the situation now is one where, in some sense, all three parties, China, the United States, and the Philippines, are confronted, no? With a situation that is not to their liking. China is confronted with a more robust and direct U.S. pressure. U.S. has to contend with a new status quo after the island construction activities of China that can, of course, in the view of many, cannot be reversed. There's greater Chinese military presence in the area now. That's the new reality that the actors have to contend with. And the Philippines, still hoping for a favorable ruling for the arbitration, may find that in the long run, the enjoyment of this fishing and energy exploration rights may not come quickly in the short term, because of issues of how to enforce. Okay, so one might say also that the geopolitical context has turned the arbitration process into what might have been a relatively simple case of determining maritime entitlements into a geopolitical contest and also a moral debate on the role of big powers and small powers in establishing a rules-based regional order. Now, quandaries, all three parties face quandaries in the management of relations and how to promote their respective interests. No? For instance, in the United States, it needs to defend its primacy, with less resources at hand. So adjustments in its strategy involving burden sharing with allies, linking spokes instead of a simple hub and spokes approach. These are also reflections of the perhaps lack of resources to put behind the huge effort required. No? U.S. has to balance between sustaining the credibility of its system of alliances, but at the same time to avoid unwanted entanglements. Based on the most recent developments, one might say that Washington has done a lot to shore up its credibility. No? But over the long term, the issues of sustainability and successful leadership of the effort to push back against China would still be in question. So there are no easy answers on how to deal with China, because China is not just an emerging peer competitor, but on certain important issues remains an important partner, no? On managing other issues like Korean Peninsula and so on. If military deterrence would be the main, I guess, role of the United States, or the main position in the South China Sea, or the most prominent role, then there are bound to be trade-offs in the other cooperative dimensions of its relationship with China that it is still trying to pursue. No? China has its own quandaries. It is clearly a dissatisfied power, but one that is not quite ready, capability-wise, to confront the United States. The Xi Jinping government has a very ambitious vision, the China Dream, rejuvenation, but this will have to be attained amidst, first of all, an economic slowdown happening in the country now. And second is rising distrust of China's intentions among its immediate neighbors. Currently, China's neighborhood policy, particularly with reference to the South China Sea, is full of contradictions. There are many elements of it, but they are poorly articulated. And it's difficult for countries to be persuaded because they are simply too many contradictions, I suppose, just to keep it simple. The 21st century Maritime Silk Road, for example, wants to embark on major infrastructure development programs, working with other countries in Southeast Asia to develop ports, railways, whatever they need to enhance connectivity of the economies, which is good, no? which is welcome by many countries. But while it does that, it challenges territorial integrity. It moves too quickly and too, in a way, forcefully with respect to competing maritime interests of even countries like Malaysia, Indonesia. It's not just the Philippines and Vietnam these days. Just a second, I lost my, okay, few cards. So Maritime Silk Road, China also has adopted a dual-track policy towards ASEAN on the South China Sea. One track says that it still prefers, negotiations, friendly consultations to address the sovereignty disputes with the affected ASEAN states. And the second track is that it is prepared to deal with ASEAN to discuss regional stability, to preserve regional stability. Now, there is hardly a clear demarcation between these two in the current situation. So how to pursue this dual track is really still a problem. There are still efforts to pursue to implement the Declaration of Conduct and to negotiate a code of conduct. But in my sense, we've been talking about the code of conduct for many years. The situation of island construction, militarization that's taking place now is what a code of conduct was supposed to be preventing in the first place. No? So are we still on the right track? No? Are we still talking about an ASEAN-China mechanism for conflict prevention, or should we be involving more and more players, since the issue has really become much bigger in many ways? No? Okay. It seems that also there are efforts by China to divide and undermine ASEAN's role in all of this. So that's another source of concern. Yeah, okay. So for the Philippines, looking at the Philippines, what are the quandaries that we have? Now, the Philippines is caught in a bind on whether to be guided by pragmatism in its approach towards China, or principlism. I didn't even know there was such a word. No? Principlism, no? Taking a principled stand, no? Especially in light of China's more muscular behavior in the South China Sea. No? This is a continuing debate. There's very much faith in the legal processes. No? We are, hopefully nearing an outcome that will be more favorable to the Philippines. No? And yet there are, China is, number one or number two biggest trading partner of the Philippines. It's not a major investor. It's the fastest rising source of tourists, no? Which is an important industry for the country. So there will always be these forces, businesses, sectors who would prefer a more normal relationship with China, regardless of the disputes. No? So even if we do get a favorable legal outcome, the long-term preference is still for a good relationship with China, and that continues to put pressure on the leadership and on the elite. Philippines has to rely on the military alliance with the United States, but even in the Philippines, the credibility, or there are questions about the sustainability of U.S. policy, well, for various reasons. One is the perception of a low level of material support in the past, the insistence on neutrality, which was such a long conversation between the U.S. I think efforts of past Philippine governments to persuade the U.S. to include the islands, claimed islands, in the scope of the Mutual Defense Treaty had been going on since the 60s. So it was really a constant conversation, and only in the last few years are the groups that prefer this kind of a strong policy, we are getting close to that situation. The loss of Scarborough Shoal in the Philippines, the involvement of the U.S. in the supposed negotiations for a mutual or a simultaneous pull-out, also showed the weakness also of the U.S. It became part of this process. It was not, the outcome, of course, was very unfavorable for the Philippines. So that also raised some questions on what role should the U.S. be playing? Should the U.S. be allowed to get between Philippines and China as far as these kinds of situations go? Okay. Another quandary is that the Philippines has staked its claim to marine resources at political cost, at great political cost. And over the long run, if the interest is access to resources, as we mentioned, and a peaceful and stable Southeast Asian region, that there is much that will need to be done cooperatively and inclusively, rather than exclusively. Okay. Also, the rivalry, the geopolitical contest, basically the power rivalry between China and the U.S., can threaten to overlay these other, smaller goals and concerns of the country, raising questions about whether core interests of the country will ultimately be served. So, now going to uncertainties, there are a number of uncertainties that make it more difficult to deal with these quandaries. Make it difficult to mitigate the impact of the earlier described self-fulfilling prophecies. As we said, we have a new status quo of Chinese military presence in the area, a more involved United States, and possibly unenforceable maritime rights claims of the Philippines and maybe other countries. While we need to go around that situation, domestic politics introduces considerable uncertainty on the part of the U.S. going forward from whoever wins in the U.S. elections in November. Will the rebalance policy persist? Particularly recent initiatives to enhance the capability of smaller regional states for maritime domain awareness, and greater visibility of the U.S. and as a deterrent to further Chinese actions. So is that going to stay with the next government? In the case of the Philippines, maybe even more so, whoever becomes the next president of the Philippines, will the new government stay the course with respect to both seeing the arbitration process through to the end? This is an especially important question if China forcefully rejects the arbitration ruling. Will the next president of the Philippines also persist in developing a more robust security partnership with the U.S., Japan, and other allies? Now, in China, there are some internal developments also that are really becoming quite interesting. And for those, of course, in international relations who watch the situation, it's difficult to make an assessment of whether they will have an impact on foreign policy in the short run. But evidence that Chinese leader Xi Jinping is beginning to encounter resistance to his disciplining, anti-corruption moves, being accused of engaging in some purging in the process, will, say, for instance, some internal debates within China about domestic as well as foreign policy direction, create opportunities for policy adjustments, maybe mending ties with neighbors that have been frayed of late by heavy-handedness on the South China Sea and the East China Sea issue. Or will internal political struggles result in more pressure on, or will increase pressure by one faction or another to show off nationalist credentials and to rally the Chinese people over these disputed areas. So relative to this, it's really how China reacts to the arbitration outcome that will be critical to regional order building efforts of the countries at this time. And the uncertainties which stem from the domestic political situations are a big question mark as well. So for solutions, there are none really that that are easy to articulate or envision. But the question is, I think, how to deter China's unilateralist, exceptionalist, coercive, and as far as ASEAN is concerned, divisive behavior. How to get China to play by the same rules as everyone else is a big question. But there's also the question of how to agree on the rules in the first place. We have been, as I mentioned, we've been talking about the code of conduct. We have been talking about CUES agreement, code of unintended or unplanned encounters at sea, extending this to involve the law enforcement authorities, the Coast Guard. So a lot of proposals have been thrown at the table. A lot of, I guess, rule-oriented proposals have still to be negotiated and agreed upon. Another question is how to bring the parties to the table to harmonize their efforts at problem solving. Strategic distrust, I think, is a very important obstacle. At the point where we find ourselves in, no matter how, on the part of the Philippines, for instance, no matter how we would like to be pragmatic, practical, we don't trust the other side. So how to overcome that? How to avoid polarization between the two major powers is also important. So the questions relevant to that would be, is there a role for middle powers? No? What about the other players who are not claimants, who are not outside of the US and China, South Korea, Australia, Canada, ASEAN collectively, Indonesia, Europe even. No? And now we are talking more and more about minilaterals. It's multilateralism, broadly defined, doesn't seem to have worked. Bilateralism, we just don't have the basic trust needed to take it on. So what other options are we ready to creatively explore? No? So I'm being bad. I'm raising questions at the end of the presentation rather than providing answers. Thank you.